Okay, we continue in the conclusion chapter of the book Textual Criticism in Quran Manuscripts. This section is titled, The Quran Consonantal Text was Standardized Early in its Textual History. Related to the degree of textual standardization is the issue of when the stabilization process took place. If the generally accepted dates to the early 7th, late century for the earliest Quranic manuscripts are accurate, then these observations support the view that the major standardizations of the basic consonantal took place between 653 and 705 AD. Also, while there may have been a longer period of flexibility of the order of the surahs in collected Qurans, it appears that the basic content of the surahs that are represented in the early manuscripts is the same as what is observed today. The questions remaining concern those portions of the Quran that do not survive in the earliest manuscripts. Also, this is not asserting that the Quran material was yet in a fixed order, even if the contents of individual surahs were decided. Overall, there is evidence that though the consonantal text was fixed within surahs, the exact number and order of the surahs may have still been flexible well into the Umayyad times and possibly into the early Abbasid era. The paleographical evidence that the consonantal text within surahs was fixed at an early date also corresponds to the conclusion reached with linguistic approach. Blau states his view in response to those who would argue a very late date for the fixation of the consonantal text of the Quran. He writes, quote, "In my opinion, indeed a new vacatur text of the Islamic revelation exists in the middle of the 7th century. A consent of the general opinion that the consonantal text of the Quran became sacred very quickly. If in fact the text of the Quran had been revised according to the rules of classical Arabic at the end of the 8th century, one would expect fully to conform to them. Yet, as it well known, this is not the case. Indeed, the deviations of the Quranic orthography of the classical spelling are sufficient proof for the traditional view that the consonantal text of the Quran in its present form became sacred quite early. If the dates assigned to the manuscripts surveyed are correct, then they could confirm this, but they could also confirm a slightly later date of the late 7th, early 8th century, and possibly a little later for the entire content of the Quran as it now stands. Blau's position and the one he's addressing are not only two alternatives. The palimpsests also provide evidence that details in the text itself were still being worked out in the late 7th century, though the general material was possibly in place. It would be difficult to attribute such high degree of uniformity to the text to anything less than the involvement of a strong centralized religious authority. This is especially true when one considers the kind of texts that are reported to have existed prior to the efforts to unify the text. According to Islamic tradition, there were various collections of the Quranic material, all being read and recited as authoritative scriptural text. There was not one initial original text from the period of Muhammad's career which was preserved with this high degree of precision. Instead, at best, one of the collections from among the various versions available were chosen to be the one text everyone would use. It was then edited heavily, and the others were forcibly suppressed. Not because they were less authentic per se, but because they presented rivals to the one chosen text and could provide a basis for political and religious competition. This seems to be the role of the collected material attributed to the Ibn Masud played in the first 3 Islamic centuries until it was finally suppressed in the wake of Ibn Masud's reforms. It was a competing authoritative text form of the canonical text form attributed to Uthman. Okay, next section, titled Informal versus Formal Standardization. From what one can tell from the palimpsest, other forms of the text would not have been radically different, but there are a very insufficient sampling of what different forms of the text may have once existed. In the 1930s, one scholar made a general comparative statement concerning the Quran's text, quote, "But while it may be true that no other work remained for 12 centuries with so pure a text, it is probably equally true that no other has suffered so drastic a purging." Unquote. Other ancient literatures seem to have gone through less formal processes of standardization. The Greek and Latin classics come to us in form largely influenced by the accidents of history. The text is reconstructed from the few examples that survive. With the new text, accidents of history, in spite of the deconstruction of Christian books in the Diocletian persecution of 300 to 315, as well as lively, unregulated culture of scribal copying, have left many manuscripts available for research. Though there are not as many from the earliest period as one might like, hundreds of New Testament texts that do survive show that the forms of text before and after Diocletian's actions were largely the same, differing only within the normal parameters of scribal practice then in use. The Hebrew Bible in the Masoretic period, 800s, is perhaps the closest model of the Quran, with its undergoing a form of formal standardization. But in the centuries before, there was a large degree of variation, similar to the degree of kind of variations found in the New Testament tradition. All manuscript traditions share certain features because they use a certain set of shared materials, forms, and paleological requirements for preserving and transmitting written text. Scriptural traditions, because of their dogmatic concerns and high devotional regard for the text, also share particular features. Within the additional overriding effort of standardization, there was also the normal and strong evidence of careful copying to preserve the meaning and form of the chosen text. Okay, next section, titled Intentionality and Non-Intentionality with Variance. Both intentional and unintentional variants were observed in the manuscript surveyed in this book. The unintentional variants were the many copyist errors observed. Most of the intentional variants related to the flexible orthography and development of more precise orthographic conventions. Others were corrections to the text, grammatical variants, and word variants. Two intentional variants were perhaps doctrinally related, or at least could be put at the service of dogmatic views. Perhaps the greatest underlying issue related to intentionality is that unified canonical text form was mainly in these manuscripts. The corrections of the text demonstrate this kind of intentional action. The palimpsest, together with the background of a partially controlled manuscript tradition in the early part of the Quranic textual history, indicate that the very shape of the consonantal text and latter the completely vocalized text of the Quran are in effect intentional variants and interpretive text forms of the consonantal text in their own right. They are also versions that were made at the expense of more original versions that were purposefully suppressed. This is especially true viewing the palimpsest and/or stories of suppression against the backdrop of Ehrman's assertion that scribes introducing variants that improve the text prevent access to precision form of the original text. The precise, uniform state of the text is testimony to an extensive, detailed, and prolonged effort to unify the manuscript tradition. It is noteworthy that, in spite of this, intentional variants that affected the meaning of the text were still found, as well as minor variants that match what was reported for existing in the codices of the companions. Substantial portions of the text have been erased and rewritten were also observed. Jeffrey's contentions that what has survived is what was considered, quote, not too unorthodox, unquote, looks very plausible. Also, there appears to have been a degree of flexibility allowed in how precisely the consonants were pointed. Rezvan noted that the development of the Aramaic orthography in the Quranic manuscripts, quote, was largely due to the need to precisely interpret the Quranic text, unquote. The orthographic development observed in the collated Quranic manuscripts made the script both a script that could be precisely pronounced for a unified recitation and a script that could be precisely interpreted for instruction and dogma.